Okay, back again here in the Petit Home Brewery. We're going to get to brewing this extract kit, and I'm going to kind of talk about, as I said before that I was going to do, going to talk about the ingredients one by one. And we'll just break all this down where some of this makes sense, because I know that first time I got one of these I was really overwhelmed. I didn't understand a lot of this stuff. So first thing I want to talk about is the malt extract. Now, I was going to sit here and ramble on about malt extract in a roundabout way to try to get you an understanding for now until we can get maybe to some later videos where we're doing all grain and stuff. But I thought, you know what? Really, to understand malt extract, we need to talk about malt. Okay, and probably the best place to start here is to just kind of go ahead and talk about, well, what is malt? And you've probably heard that word a lot before. You've heard of malt balls and malt beer and things like that. So what is malt? Well, malt is basically any grain that has been through the malting process. We just call it malt for short. And almost, most of the time in beer we're talking about malted barley, which is what I have I've got a few different types here in front of you. I'll talk about those more here in a minute. But a long time ago, probably hundreds of years ago, and even back as far as people have been making beer, what they would do is they would take these grains and they would harvest them, and they would go through the malting process, and then they would just go directly into the mashing process. That's not how we do it in modern times. Brewers, they mash their own grains, and so this gives the freedom of for a brewer to make whatever kind of beer they want to make in whatever way they want to mash it. So when they malt grain, the whole reason for doing it is that if we took unmalted grain and we mashed it, that is, we put it in some hot water and let it hang out for a while, inside these grains there's starches. They're complex carbohydrates. They're not something that brewer's yeast can ferment. So we need to change the carbohydrates, the starches in these, into more simpler sugars. And the sugar that we're going to change those into is actually called maltose. And so the malting process, what it does is it unlocks enzymes that are in the malt, so that those enzymes can change the carbohydrates into simple sugars that we can ferment. I know that the first few times I heard this, it kind of went in one ear and out the other, and I'm a science geek, but it didn't really all fit to me until I had to really sit back and think about it. But the enzymes are not really there until the grain has been malted, and without the enzymes there would be no converting of the starches to sugars. That's the simplest way to put it. And when they malt grain, what they do is they kind of keep it at a certain moisture content for a little while, and then they basically put it in some hot water. And there's a whole bunch of different ways. There's floor malting, and then there's ways like this wasn't floor malted, although you can't tell the difference by looking at. They kind of do it in a more modern way, although you can still buy floor malted grain if that's what you want. And they basically make the grain germinate, or trick it into going ahead and starting to sprout. And that's when those enzymes, that's when they're kind of born, so to speak. And from there, what they do is they go ahead and dry the grain back out, and that way they can ship it to brewers around the world in a more convenient way, because you can't ship wet grain around. It would mold, or it would go ahead, and if you let it sit in the hot water long enough, it would go ahead and start to convert. And when they dry it out, they use like a kiln, and it makes a difference in how they do this whole process as to how the grain's going to taste. Now, all three of these that I've got here to show you are just some real common malted barley. And it's what you're mostly going to see as a brewer, but that's not to say that other grains can't be malted either. I mean, you can see malted oats. They're not very common. Mostly you're going to find oats that have been rolled, but you can find them. You can find malted wheat, malted corn, just about any kind of grain really. You can find it in a malted form. But malted barley is kind of more special than the others because it contains what we call a lot of diastatic power. It has enough enzymes to easily convert itself, and it can convert other things that we put in there with it. So if we wanted to, we could use, say for instance, 80% malted barley, and we could put 20% of an unmalted grain in there easily, and it would convert. The malted barley would go ahead and convert itself. That is to say, the starches that are in it into sugars, and there's enough enzymes to go ahead and convert other things. So if we put oats, rolled oats, or if we put rice or something, another unmalted grain, we can convert that too. So malted barley, it's just a preferred grain for making beer. I mean, you'll really almost never see a beer that doesn't have at least some malted barley, although mostly all beer has it's made up of at least 70% malted barley, although there's some wheat beers out there that really don't have any malted barley, but I mean it's more the exception than it is the rule. Okay, now malt extract, what that is that's when a company takes and they malt the grain, or they take malted grain and they go ahead and mash it. Now what happens during the mashing process is basically we put this grain into some hot water about 150, 160 degrees, and we let it hang out for an hour, hour and a half, and that we go ahead and convert the starches into sugar, and we go ahead and get those sugars and starches gelatinized where they can kind of get into a liquid, and then we drain the liquid out, and we would leave this grain behind, because we would basically have gotten everything out of it that we wanted at that point. And from then on, it's trash or cattle feed or whatever. It's not any use to a brewer anymore. And so the liquid or the malt extract companies, what they do is they take that liquid that they drain off the mash, and they go ahead and condense it down into a form that they can ship out easily, and that home brewers, and I mean there's a few, you'll see some smaller commercial brewers that use malt extract too, and malt extract is actually very, very widely used in food. So most of the malt extract that's made actually gets used in food. It's in a lot more foods than what you would think. I might be wrong on this, but I think it's in like baby formula and different candies and desserts and breakfast cereals, and there's a whole lot of stuff that has malt extract in it that you probably don't realize. So if you check out the ingredients on different foods that you buy, and you'll start to notice that. And malt extract comes in two basic forms: liquid and dried. And so if you see the abbreviation DME, that stands for dried malt extract, and LME would stand for liquid malt extract. Obviously this is the liquid. Now it's a real thick syrup is what it's been boiled down into a syrup. And I don't have any dried malt extract to show you, but it's kind of a yellowish or off-white cream colored, real dry, fine powder. And they make it into a powder by basically getting it down to a condensed form, and then I believe they shoot it through some nozzles at really high pressure, and that kind of the moisture kind of dries out as it falls down. And it's a pretty complex process the way I understand it, because they have to keep it from clumping up and things like that. And just a quick note on the quality and the storage of malt extract. You don't find a lot of the lower quality malt extract that you used to, and we're getting to see a lot more variety too. The liquid malt extract can darken over time. So if you're buying some liquid malt extract, I mean, just keep that in mind. But if you've got a kit that's been sitting around for a year, don't worry about it. Go ahead and brew with it. But if you're buying it in bulk, I mean, just kind of make sure that maybe you can use it before, you know, it starts to kind of darken on you. The dried malt extract, the problem that I found is if you buy a big bag of it and you open it up, like I live here in Arkansas and it's really humid, it'll kind of start to get clumpy on you over time, so you kind of have to watch that. One of the problems that we used to have with malt extract is we were really limited in a lot of people, let me back up here for a second. A lot of people think that if you use malt extract, you're going to brew an inferior beer, and that's not true at all. And as I'm going to try to help explain to you over the next so many videos, it's your fermentation process that's going to make or break your beer. And having a decent recipe is part of it, but whether or not you used all grain or you used malt extract, it doesn't matter all that much. Now, used to, when we bought malt extract, we would kind of buy just malt extract, liquid malt extract, or sometimes it would say like light or dark. You didn't really have a lot of choice, and so that part did kind of limit a brewer. For example, if you wanted to make an Oktoberfest, well, you just bought dark malt extract and you just used that, and you didn't really know what kind of grain, what kind of malt you were getting. But now, when you buy malt extract, you can get Maris Otter malt extract, you can get Munich malt extract, wheat malt extract, you can get just such a big variety. You can get Pilsner malt extract, so you can actually choose the right ones to make a particular beer if you're really going for something special. So anyway, I thought that I would also just kind of talk about the few different types of malted barley that you'll see. These are just a few types that I happen to have on hand. Now visually you can't really see any difference. And this, again, I don't know if I mentioned it before, this is what we call our base grain. This is what will be making up most of all our fermentable sugars are going to come from. And it does contribute to the flavor of the beer depending on what type you use, but your specialty grains and hops and things like that, obviously they're going to play, you know, a big factor too. But this is Munich malt. Munich it's a German in origin, and it's usually kilned to a little bit darker. You really can't tell here. It's usually about 10 Lovibond, and that Lovibond is a scale that can help you kind of get an idea of how dark a grain has been kilned. Munich malt it's in a lot of German beers. It's in a Munich Helles. It's in Oktoberfest, and it's a good malt to do all kind. If you're looking for a more richer, maltier, complex flavor, it's a good one to go with. This is 6-row, and there's two basic types of barley out there. There's 6-row and 2-row, and in 6-row, it's not used by homebrewers very much, really. It has a real high, what we call diastatic power. It has a lot of enzymes in it. It's used, if you drink a Bud Light or something, that they use 6-row. And it's not, like I said, homebrewers do use it, but it's not quite as common in the homebrew world. And I'll try to get in there close so maybe you can kind of see. Just really not a lot of difference in one to the other visually. And this is 2-row. 2-row is your basic. It's just, homebrewers use the heck out of it. It's your regular old 2-row, and there's different brands and stuff, but it's really the workhorse of homebrewers or any kind of brewer, really. It's just a good all-around malt to use for just general purpose. You can really use it for anything. Some other ones that I don't have here would be Pilsner malt. Pilsner malt has a real distinct flavor, and I'm not super crazy about it. I'll use it when I brew a Pilsner or certain German beers and stuff, but I've never been, it's not that it's bad, it's personal preference. I've never been real crazy about it. In 2-row, now I want to explain the difference in this. You'll see pale 2-row, which is regular old 2-row, and then you'll see a kind called pale ale 2-row or pale ale malt, and that's been kilned a little bit darker. and that's going to give you a little more body in your beer, a little more of that bready, toasty type of flavors and stuff. And one real famous pale ale malt is Maris Otter, and Maris Otter costs quite a bit more. And a lot of times you'll see some like Roar has a really good pale ale malt that I buy all the time. I just love it. And that Maris Otter has its own flavor, and a lot of homebrewers, they swear by it. It costs a little bit more, but a lot of people will tell you that it's really worth the money. But I find myself a lot of times just buying the regular pale ale malt, because the Roar brand especially, again, personal preference, but I just really like it. There's other types of malts. I mean, obviously, again, I don't have any wheat malts or rye or oat malt here to show you, but just know that there are other besides barley. But in the barley world, I mean, everything I just covered is kind of really the most common, or what you're more likely to see. So again, these are just the base grains, and we'll go over specialty grains and stuff here in a little bit. But I just kind of didn't mean to get off on a tangent about the malt extract, but I really felt like it was important to kind of back up and explain that before we go forward.